Peter Green, an artist once hailed as one of the greatest blues guitarists England ever produced. He was the man behind Black Magic Woman, the founding architect of Fleetwood Mac, and the soulful writer of instrumentals like Albatross. But in the decades that followed, mention of his name faded from the mainstream. Where did he go? What happened to that brilliant spark that burned so bright but so briefly? Tonight we're diving deep into the life of Peter Green, a story of musical genius, heartbreak, and a mind adrift in the undertow of its own visions. Before we fully explore that turbulent journey, let's gently rewind to a time when London was a throbbing epicenter of creativity and experimentation. In the mid-1960s, England was buzzing with new sounds. The British invasion had unleashed the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and Eric Clapton's guitar wizardry in the Bluesbreakers. Young people prowled record shops, hungry for American blues albums imported from Chicago or the Mississippi Delta. City clubs had a certain electricity as local bands mashed the gritty rawness of American blues together with the fresh energy of British rock. It was in this cultural stew that Peter Green, born Peter Allen Greenbaum in 1946, developed a love for music. Peter grew up in London's East End, in a working-class Jewish family that wasn't particularly wealthy but was close-knit. The sounds of skiffle, early rock and roll, and the swirling energy of the city's music scene percolated around him. Even as a boy, he showed a desire to pick up guitars and emulate his heroes. A turning point came when he first heard the poignant cry of blues guitar, B.B. King's vibrato, Freddie King's stinging leads, and the haunting intensity of John Lee Hooker. He was still just a teenager when he dedicated himself to mastering the intricacies of that style. By the age of 15, Peter was performing in local bands, plugging in anywhere that would let him on stage, already demonstrating a fluid touch and a soulful sensitivity beyond his years. Friends described him as quiet but determined, a young musician who seemed to live in a world of his own, though his eyes lit up whenever the talk turned to guitar tones or new records worth listening to. In 1966, Peter's big break arrived unexpectedly. He landed a spot as the lead guitarist in John Mayall in the Bluesbreakers, the same group that had launched Eric Clapton's fame. After Clapton left to form Cream, Mayall needed a replacement. Peter Green auditioned and got the gig. At that time, Clapton was practically worshipped for his role on the album Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton. So stepping into his shoes was no small task. Fans even joked, "Clapton is God," a piece of graffiti scrawled on London walls. Most guitarists would have been terrified, but Peter had a calm confidence. He knew he wasn't Clapton. He didn't want to be. He wanted to be Peter Green. Still, the pressure was on. During one of his earliest appearances, critics were poised to dismiss him as just a lesser stand-in. Yet as soon as Peter's nimble fingers glided across the strings, he silenced the skeptics. His touch was different, softer, subtler, but undeniably captivating. The legendary B.B. King would later comment that Peter Green gave him the cold sweats because of his sweet, crying tone. Unlike the fiery, in-your-face approach favored by many rock blues guitarists, Green's style breathed and sighed. He could be both thunder and whisper in the same phrase, weaving delicate emotional lines that left you feeling he was pouring out his soul through 6 strings. During his time with John Mayall, Peter contributed to the album A Hard Road, which showcased not only his soulful playing, but also his emerging songwriting talents. Though overshadowed by Clapton's legacy in the band, he'd taken a major step forward in forging his own identity. He was also quietly studying the business, how touring worked, how recording sessions were set up, and how Mayall balanced the line between blues tradition and commercial viability. All of these experiences contributed to Green's next and far more impactful venture, forming a group that would eventually become Fleetwood Mac. The name Fleetwood Mac might conjure images of Stevie Nicks twirling in shawls, Lindsey Buckingham layering lush harmonies, or Christine McVie's resonant voice capturing the heartbreak of countless love stories. However, that version of Fleetwood Mac, the radio-friendly hit machine, was born years later under quite different leadership. In its earliest incarnation, the band was anchored by a raw, blues-focused ethos that came from Peter Green. He recruited fellow Bluesbreakers Mick Fleetwood on drums and John McVie on bass. Initially, John was uncertain about leaving the stability of Mayall's band, but Peter persisted. To sweeten the deal, he even named the band Fleetwood Mac, combining Fleetwood's surname with McVie's, hoping it would convince them both to stick around. And so in 1967, Fleetwood Mac was born as a British blues band. In those first couple of years, Fleetwood Mac was not about radio pop or breezy California tunes. It was about earthy guitar licks, pounding rhythms, and a devotion to authenticity. They were well received in the UK blues scene, playing clubs and festivals to audiences who devoured this new wave of British blues. Peter Green quickly became recognized as the creative force. He wrote and sang many of the original songs like Black Magic Woman. Yes, the one Santana later turned into a global smash. But in Green's original, you can feel that undercurrent of mysterious sorrow. It had a raw edge, revealing something about the depth of Green's emotional world. In 1968, Fleetwood Mac released Mr. Wonderful, their second album, which continued their electric blues direction. It sold modestly, and the band was building a steady following. Peter, however, wasn't interested in merely repeating the same formula. He pushed them to experiment. The result was Albatross, a dreamy instrumental that soared to number 1 in the UK. Listeners were floored by its gentle melody. It was neither scorching blues nor typical rock. Instead, it felt like drifting over a moonlit ocean, calm yet tinged with a kind of lonely yearning. Albatross brought commercial attention, but also signaled that Peter Green's artistic instincts were expanding far beyond blues rock constraints. Things appeared to be going well. By 1969, Peter Green was known as one of Britain's best guitarists. Fleetwood Mac had multiple charting singles, and they toured steadily. But behind those successes lurked a shadow. Green was grappling with an internal struggle. He was uneasy about fame and fortune. He had been raised to think about the less privileged, to question excess and embrace humility. So as the money started rolling in, he found it morally troubling. He donated large sums to charities, sometimes leaving his bandmates worried about their finances. His psyche was also under strain from the rigors of constant touring, the weight of leadership, and the swirling pressures of the music industry. And then there was LSD, a potent mind-altering drug that had become almost fashionable in the counterculture scene. Green experimented, at first cautiously, but increasingly more recklessly. The turning point came in March 1970, when Fleetwood Mac toured Europe. One night in Munich, Germany, Peter was invited to a party hosted by a group sometimes described as a cult-like commune. Accounts vary on precisely what happened, but it's said that Peter took a massive dose of LSD. Some who were there claim it was administered to him without warning. Others suggest he partook willingly. Whichever the case, the result was catastrophic for his already fragile psyche. He began to experience severe hallucinations, paranoia, and what would later be diagnosed as the onset of schizophrenia. It wasn't just a bad trip. This was a life-altering event, one from which he would never fully recover. After that night in Munich, Peter's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He started dressing in robes, wearing a crucifix, and insisting the band should give away their earnings. He felt a profound spiritual calling, convinced that focusing on money was evil. Sessions became strained. Bandmates were confused and exasperated. By mid-1970, Peter announced he was leaving Fleetwood Mac. The group that bore Mick Fleetwood's and John McVie's names was about to lose its founding visionary. What followed for Peter was a descent into near obscurity, marked by mental health challenges so severe that for years he was essentially lost to the music world. He'd sporadically record or perform, like on the album The End of the Game in 1970, a free-form, psychedelic-tinged project that baffled critics, but most of the time he drifted off the radar. The man once hailed as a blues prodigy now floated from place to place, sometimes living in the countryside, other times in modest London flats, often struggling just to keep himself grounded. Close friends tried to help, but the swirl of psychosis was unrelenting. Some remember him wandering the streets, looking disheveled, muttering to himself or to unseen voices. Stories from that period paint a haunting picture. In one account, Peter showed up at his friend's apartment late at night in a manic state, raving that he had to burn all his money. Another time, he reportedly gave away guitars or refused royalties, as if convinced money was poisoning his soul. He also spent periods in mental health institutions, heavily medicated and grappling with paranoid delusions. In the eyes of the public and even many in the industry, Peter had vanished. Meanwhile, Fleetwood Mac underwent numerous lineup changes, eventually landing on the combination of Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, and Christine McVie. That incarnation soared to superstardom in the mid to late 1970s, producing Rumors, one of the best-selling albums of all time. Yet behind the celebrations and record-breaking tours, the band seldom spoke of Peter Green. He was, for them, a painful memory, the friend they once followed in their early quest for blues authenticity, now lost somewhere between reality and delusion. The personal pain of all this is difficult to overstate. Imagine a mind that soared, writing haunting melodies one day, and then the next, that same mind is besieged by voices, illusions, and paranoid fears. Peter sometimes believed spiritual forces were communicating with him. He claimed to see angels, or so the stories go. Musicians who visited him in later years found him either oddly calm or alarmingly agitated. He might pick up a guitar, play a few bars that sparkled with the old magic, and then suddenly stop, almost as if frightened by his own gift. The brilliance was still there. It never truly left, but it was buried under layers of psychological torment. During the 1980s and early 1990s, Peter's name was occasionally invoked by older music aficionados, or in guitar magazines that celebrated his brief but pivotal contributions. Young fans of Fleetwood Mac's pop rock hits had little idea who he was or that he'd been the founder of the band. Occasionally, a rumor would surface. He's living as a gardener, he's homeless, he's in an asylum, or he's doing odd jobs around London. Some rumors had elements of truth, others were purely speculative. Various people tried to coax him back into the studio, but the attempts were usually short-lived. He played on a few obscure sessions, a track here, a cameo there, but each time the question remained, would Peter Green ever truly return? An interesting glimmer of hope arrived in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the formation of the Peter Green Splinter Group, which included guitarist Nigel Watson. This was a modest comeback. The Splinter Group recorded several albums focusing on blues standards as well as some original material. Fans who saw Peter Green during this era described him as subdued on stage, often staring off into the distance. But when he did connect with the music, it was like witnessing a dormant spark flicker to life. The band's early shows had an under-rehearsed vibe, but for longtime devotees, it was moving just to see Peter alive, playing guitar and singing, even if softly. Some nights you could catch a fleeting glimpse of the genius that once enthralled audiences back in the 1960s. Those moments, ephemeral as they were, proved that deep inside, the soul of Peter Green still breathed. Yet even this renewal was tentative. The Splinter Group didn't headline major festivals or chart with platinum-selling albums. Their audience was mostly dedicated blues fans and curious onlookers. Peter seemed ambivalent about returning to the spotlight. His mental health was still fragile, yet this period still gave birth to some precious recordings. Listening to them, you hear a more mature, introspective guitarist, someone who knows both the ecstasy and the darkness within music. Occasionally, on certain tracks, he'd sound almost at peace, as if the chaotic swirl in his mind had receded enough for him to channel that famous tone once more. Meanwhile, controversies and debates surrounded his life story. One question that arises is, was it truly just one bad acid trip that triggered his schizophrenia, or were there earlier signs of a predisposition? Some suggest the seeds of Peter's mental challenges were always present. He was a sensitive soul, prone to mood swings and anxieties. Others maintain that the fateful Munich incident was the start of his downfall, unleashing a permanent psychotic break. Then there's the moral debate about whether LSD should bear all the blame, or if the relentless pressure of the music industry also played a major role. We should remember that in the late 60s, psychedelics were hailed by some as mind-expanding catalysts. For Peter, though, they became the door to a nightmare he couldn't shut. As public awareness of mental illness has grown, modern commentators view Peter's story through a more empathetic lens. It's a cautionary tale about the precarious line between creative genius and psychological vulnerability. Bandmates and friends tell different stories too, especially regarding how supportive they were or weren't. Mick Fleetwood wrote in his memoir that he tried to stand by Peter, but as the band's fortunes rose, it was difficult to reconcile the day-to-day responsibilities of leading a now high-profile act with caring for a troubled ex-member. There's also the lingering question of whether Fleetwood Mac, once they became superstars, downplayed Peter's role in their origin. While Mick Fleetwood and John McVie always gave Peter credit in interviews, the unstoppable success of Rumors overshadowed those early blues years for the general public. And Peter, for his part, never seemed comfortable seeking credit or recognition. He shunned personal accolades, even as older fans and younger guitar enthusiasts revered him. One rarely mentioned anecdote from Peter's wandering years comes from an old friend who encountered him living in a small English village, quietly renting a dilapidated cottage. According to the friend, Peter was raising chickens in the backyard, spending his days peacefully, occasionally scribbling lyrics in a notebook. Every so often, he'd pick up a battered acoustic guitar and sing old standards, music from the 1930s and 40s, reminiscent of what his parents might have listened to. This image offers a poignant contrast to the rock star narrative. Instead of arenas, groupies, and after parties, we see a gentle soul who may have found comfort in nature, far from the pressures that once consumed him. For many years, fans wondered if the man who composed Oh Well and Man of the World felt bitterness about Fleetwood Mac's subsequent achievements without him. Interviews from the early 2000s, though few, generally suggest that Peter felt more sorrow than envy. He once admitted that he simply couldn't handle the business side of success. In another interview, he praised the 1970s lineup of Fleetwood Mac for its sheer musicality, calling Lindsey Buckingham's guitar playing impressive. That sense of generosity, even humility, was a hallmark of Peter's personality, underlying his reluctance to chase fame or fortune. By the time the 2010s rolled around, Peter Green was living a quiet life in the English countryside. He wasn't entirely a recluse. He had close friends, occasional visitors, and sometimes entertained the idea of a small project or jam session. But there were no illusions of a grand comeback. Some YouTube videos show him at small gigs, looking older with a heavier frame and eyes that still occasionally wander, as though searching for a reality that might be more stable than the one he'd known. In these brief appearances, he'd pick up his guitar, and despite not playing as fluidly as in his younger days, the tone still carried that ache, that whispered longing which had set him apart decades before. His final story arrived without the big tributes or mainstream fanfare that often accompany legendary musicians. Peter Green passed away in his sleep on July 25, 2020, at the age of 73. Much of the world was distracted by the global events of that year, and the news didn't dominate headlines. To those who deeply admired him, the loss was monumental. Tributes did pop up in music circles. Fellow guitarists, from blues veterans to modern rock heroes, all lamented the passing of one of the greatest and most original voices on the instrument. Many cited him as the ultimate example of less is more, praising the gentleness and subtlety he brought to the guitar. Yet for younger audiences or casual Fleetwood Mac fans, Peter's name still remains dim, overshadowed by the band's later pop success. Fleetwood Mac themselves have occasionally paid homage, but not with the consistent reverence one might expect for their founder. To be fair, Mick Fleetwood did organize a star-studded tribute concert to Peter Green's music in February 2020, just months before Peter's death, featuring the likes of David Gilmour, Christine McVie, Steven Tyler, and more. Peter, however, didn't attend, presumably due to health or personal reasons. That night might have been an unwitting farewell, a salute from peers who recognized Peter's foundational role in shaping the band and modern blues rock. And so we find ourselves left with a story that resonates on multiple levels, an extraordinary talent that flared like a supernova, only to be submerged by internal storms of paranoia and schizophrenia. A musician who wrote some of the most enchanting blues rock tunes of the late 1960s, yet fled from the fame and fortune those works generated. A quiet, humble man whose soul was seemingly too sensitive for the cutthroat world of rock stardom. His journey calls to mind both the romantic notion of the tortured artist and a sobering reminder of how fragile the human psyche can be. In the end, the sorrow in Peter Green's music may have been a reflection of his own internal struggles, giving it an authentic emotional weight that fans could feel in every note. It's easy to see why folks call him a tragic figure, but it would be too simplistic to define him solely in those terms. There was also genuine triumph in what he accomplished, even if that triumph was short-lived. Peter Green forged a new branch of British blues, showcased a rare melodic sensitivity on guitar, and penned songs that continue to captivate. His influence rippled through generations of musicians. Everyone from Gary Moore, who famously acquired and revered Peter's old Les Paul, to modern players who try to capture just a fraction of that soulful phrasing. Indeed, the notion of Green's tone has become somewhat legendary among guitar aficionados, emblematic of a delicate balance between clarity and emotional depth. From a broader historical perspective, Peter Green reminds us of the overlooked contributors to major cultural waves, those who initiate movements but don't stick around to reap the benefits. In the story of Fleetwood Mac, there would be no hits like Rhiannon or Go Your Own Way had Peter not laid down the band's foundation. In the tapestry of British blues, he stands alongside Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and others of the 1960s scene. yet he is often the one name that younger fans may struggle to recall. With mental health discussions becoming more open, Peter's ordeal also sparks modern conversations about how the music industry and society at large treats artists who suffer from severe psychological conditions. The stark reality is that he slipped through the cracks in a world that wasn't equipped to provide the nuanced care he needed. So what should we, as listeners and admirers, take away from the life of Peter Green? Perhaps it's a reminder that art doesn't come without cost. The line between inspiration and emotional burden can be perilously thin. In Peter's case, a series of vulnerabilities, personal, chemical, psychological, collided at precisely the wrong time. Yet throughout his life, even in the darkest phases, the deep humanity in his playing never fully vanished. We hear it in the handful of Splinter Group recordings where he plays with measured restraint, as if every note is precious. We see it in interviews where his gentle eyes reveal a man who never lost his basic kindness, even if his grip on reality sometimes slipped. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.